Okay, welcome back. We're going to be covering chapter 38 on autocracies by Stephen Haber. It's a really interesting chapter. It's really the only perspective we're going to get on autocracy, so I'm glad we sort of threw this one on the syllabus. So, Stephen Haber wants to know about autocracies, how they function, and especially how they relate to property rights and to economic growth. And so, he opens the chapter up talking about, first of all, we know very little about autocracies, right? It's hard to get in and research them. It's hard to get. There's no right Freedom of Information Acts or anything like that. Journalism is often suppressed, and so it's really hard to get data on autocracies, and we know very little about dictatorships. Um, we do know that dictatorships do tend to offer fewer property rights, of course, or social services to their citizens. Um, but they do have economic growth sort of on par with the average democracy, despite starting at very low levels of absolute wealth, right? Um, a lot of dictatorships tend to have really high growth rates. So if you look at Mexico in the 20th century, under the PRI, or if you look at Korea, South Korea, not North Korea, when South Korea was an autocracy before their transition to democracy, they had a very, very high growth rate. Um, Nazi Germany had a very high growth rate before, they were bombed by the West. Um, so the question here is, why do some autocracies have better growth rates and economic performance than others? Um, and so we talk a little bit about the early literature, right? And there's really two strands on autocracy, and it's sociological literature, which breaks down autocracies into different types. The problem here is that the types have proliferated just extremely. And so there are dozens of hypothesized or theorized types of autocracies. The problem with this is, right, when you have so many, they start to become meaningless. And so it almost comes to a point where every autocracy sort of is their own type, right? And how is that helpful? Um, so instead, Haber introduces the economic theories. And instead of looking at the type of democracy, they look at what are the incentives of the leadership of a democracy. And they basically say there's two possible leaderships, right? You have the actual dictator who has their own incentives, but then you have what's called the selectorate, or what he calls, and what did he call that? Oh, the launching organization. Um, and this is the idea that there is some organization within your society that helped you take over the state, right? And that same organization that overcame the collective action problems of putting you into the dictatorship can similarly overcome the collective action problems of removing you from that dictatorship. And so you have to keep this selectorate or this launching organization happy. Um, so he goes through a little bit of the literature, which we'll talk about. This sort of economic approach to dictatorships started pretty late in social research. In 1987, he says, is basically the first paper that came out using this approach, and it was Tullock. And he just assumes one goal, basically, that the leader wants to hold on to office, right? This is the one assumption he puts in his model. He basically says there's this fear that you'll be jailed or exiled or murdered if your state is taken over. Uh, and basically, what he comes down to is that, everyone in your society has to profess some sense of loyalty. Um, but because everyone has to profess loyalty, you as the dictator are very insecure, um, because you don't know who's actually loyal, right? And so it moves on to Wintrobe in 2000, who argues that autocrats really have two approaches to keeping their power, right? They can redistribute wealth or they can use repression. And then Buena de Mesquita comes in, who's from NYU, who we'll read later in the semester. And he says, well, no, it's not about keeping the citizens happy. It's about keeping this very small, what he calls selectorate, happy. And this selectorate are those in your society who have sort of elite influence, right? They're the very wealthy, they're the very politically connected, they're the people who run your military or your police organizations, and they have the power to sort of influence the dictator because of their positions in society, right? So Haber wants to continue this approach and add on to it. But he says, okay, there's actually some use in both approaches. So I'm going to use a a three state typology for autocracy. So I'm going to add the sociological element by adding a topology. But I'm also going to use the economic approach of talking about the incentives of leaders. Okay. So he's mixing the two approaches. And he says basically, we want to know what the implications for political repression, property rights, economic growth, and democratic transitions are. Okay. So let's start with his theory. Part one dives into Haber's theory, and it's called an organizational theory of dictatorship, right? And he basically just suggests that autocrats are concerned about the political entrepreneurs and their society, or the launching organization, or the selectorate, whatever we want to call it, and the groups they need. So the question here is, why don't they just simply repress them, right? That would be the easiest answer. But there are problems with this, right? First, the dictator actually needs this group to take and hold power, right? Um, you need the military, you need a party, you need the royal family or some revolutionary group to get you into power. And so you have some loyalty to these people. But you also need them to operate the state, right? You are a single person. You cannot operate all the bureaucracies and institutions and the police organization and the military and the Department of Agriculture and this and that, right? You have to have some cadre of followers to be able to operate the state. Um, and um, the launching organization, who was able to sort of, like I said earlier, overcome the collective action problem of getting you into the state, is also able to overcome the collective action problem of removing you from office. Um, and what we know about coups is that the vast majority of them, especially in dictatorships, and the vast majority of successful ones, come from the military and not from the citizenry. It's not like the Arab Spring, where you have this sort of giant uprising that we saw in 2012. That's an anomaly. Um, like I said, the majority of these coups are from the military, and so there's a lot of nervousness right here, right? And so you really have two options here. You can bend to the will of your selectorate and sort of become a puppet dictator. We know that some of those exist. Um, you can repress and maybe sort of engender a revolution against you, right? So if you start killing people, people are going to notice and maybe they rise up. So Haber says you have three strategies. The dictator only really has three strategies to deal with this problem of the selectorate or the launching organization being able to overpower you and remove you from office. The first strategy is terror. You can use terror against the leadership, or the launching organization. The second is you can co-opt. You can basically buy them off, right? And then the third approach is to create rival organizations in the society, to sort of water down the collective action of the launching organization. You can shift the power to new organizations, um, and make the collective action problem much more difficult to overcome. which was sort of the Hitler approach and Mexico's approach with the PRI. And so we move on to section 2, right? We've sort of talked about the theory and where we're going. Section 2 is a small aside. There's a famous Nobel Prize winning book by a man named Mancur Olson, um, who would whose book would sort of contest everything that Haber is saying, right? Haber is saying your spot as a dictatorship is very nerve wracking, right? You're concerned that you could lose your spot at any time. Mancur Olson takes a very different approach in 2000 in his very famous book. And his assumption says that autocrats don't face any internal pressure, right? And this allows them to become what he calls stationary bandits. And this stationary banditry creates an incentive for these dictators to enforce property rights, to invest in public goods, and to tax at the sort of revenue maximizing rate in the long run, right? And so you should see this highly efficient, um, very well run dictatorship under these sort of assumptions. But that's bullshit, right? We don't see these sort of benign dictators except in extremely rare cases like South Korea because they were under the watchful eye of the United States government, right? They are extremely rare. Plus, the statistics show that long lived dictators are very rare, right? You have some like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, maybe Saddam Hussein in Iraq, but the vast majority of them are gone in a year or 2 years or a few years because they can't overcome this problem of internal pressure, especially from sort of the elites in society, the wealthy, and the military. And so that's what you saw all across Africa. That's what you've seen all across Asia. And that's especially what you saw in South America, sort of in the mid 20th century, where military dictatorships were commonly taking over either former autocracies that they thought were poorly run or new fledgling democracies that they thought were poorly run. And so Mancur Olson's sort of whole assumption that there's no internal pressure and that you're going to get this sort of 50-year benign king, um, there's very little statistical or real life evidence for this sort of utopian view of dictatorship, right? Plus, we know that the allies of these dictatorships have incentives, right? We know these are human beings and they have incentives to act. So I don't know, Mansard Olson's, while it was a very sort of beautifully written and interesting book, I don't really think it fits the reality very well. And so, that aside, we'll move on to Haber's logic. All right, so he's going to introduce the three approaches a dictatorship can take to deal with the launching organization problems, right? And so the first part 3 is the logic of terror. This is the most direct strategy you can use to sort of curb the launching organizations. But there are problems with this, right? The results are that it foments a lot of distrust in the launching organization. They don't know who's tattling on whom. Um, and so it makes coordination very difficult, right? Because you have a sort of secret police out there monitoring the internal communications and meetings of potential rivals. And so coordination becomes very difficult in these states. You can imagine a state like Stalinist Russia, right? Where the KGB or, whatever it was called back in the day, the FSB or, whatever was sort of the internal secret police, and they were constantly monitoring not only party apparatchiks, but the heads of institutions and bureaus, the heads of government organizations, the heads of rival organizations, the heads of the military, and so as it states in the book, Stalin killed anywhere from 1.5 million to 2.5 million just of his own sort of bureaucrats and soldiers, military leadership. And so this makes it very difficult for the leadership um, to be able to coordinate. Um, it also one of the drawbacks to this is the leader doesn't know what information that they can trust. Right? You're usually using torture, um, and so you don't necessarily know what information you can trust, and so you purge sort of indiscriminately. And we know that Stalin even would purge his own military leaders, and even executed two of his own secret police leaders in the KGB. So, yeah, there's a lot of sort of paranoia in this society too. But we also know that this is kind of rare, right? This is sort of Mao Zedong, um, maybe Papa Dr. Valier, um, Stalin. But there's some problems with this. If you screw this up, you're going to die, and you're probably going to die horribly, as we saw with a leader like Ceausescu, who was murdered in the streets. Um, So you'll likely be deposed. Another problem is that you have to create the secret police, right? And we know that the secret police can be a threat to you itself, right? Because you're investing power in this very powerful organization, and they have their own incentives. And so, we saw a person like Putin come up through the ranks of the secret police. So we know this kind of thing can offer competition to the dictator himself. Um, and then the final problem is that killing your own bureaucrats and government leaders and military leaders, it screws up your government. You can't. How do you function as a government when when everyone who is in your government keeps being killed by the leader, right? So this makes it very difficult. Um, okay, what are the implications for property rights here? Haber suggests that the implications are that the so-called selectorate in this analogy is a selectorate of just one, the dictator himself. And the dictator has a widespread incentive for corruption and theft of resources, right? And so we did see this under Stalin. We did see this under Mao Zedong. We did see this under Papa Dr. Valier. Um, and so you also have really no incentive to institute property rights, right? Um, and if you do declare that there are property rights, they're not credible. Any promise of these, I'm sorry, the trash truck is right behind my house right now, so that's funny. I'm going to go inside. Hang on. Okay. Um, so any declaration of property rights won't be taken seriously, right? So this generally tends to lead to just extreme expropriation of resources because there's no tax base. If there's no property rights, there's really not going to be any sort of entrepreneurship. There's no real market. There's no tax base. So everything gets expropriated, right? Oil, any resources you have in the society, land will just be sort of expropriated willy nilly. Um, and all of this tends to lead to extremely poor economic growth. And so if you look at states like Stalin's Soviet Union or Saddam's Iraq or Mao's China or modern day North Korea, all of these sort of fit this terror model. And they all have piss poor growth rates, right? Very poor property rights and very poor growth rates. Then we move on to option two, co-optation. You can simply buy the loyalty of the selectorate or the launching organization, right? There are some problems with this strategy, though. If the rents are coming from the state, um, takeover of the state would help them get the same rents or potentially more. And so the dictator's position sometimes isn't necessarily better off. Um, So you want to try and ensure that the rents aren't coming only, only directly from the state itself and the state bureaucracies. You want to try to ensure that there's some sort of private market. Um, so how is this pulled off in reality? Generally, what you do is you set up monopoly systems for your cronies in particular industries, right? So you'll give someone, some group a monopoly over the railroad system, and another a monopoly over public utilities, and another a monopoly over, man, I don't know, say agriculture. Um, and another a monopoly over, I don't know, electricity, right? And so what you do is you put import restrictions on imported goods. You give preferential taxation to your cronies. You require licensing to get into those fields, and then you ensure that no competitors are able to get the license, right? And so you build these monopolies. Um, this can be good in the short run, at least economically. You do tend to get a little bit more property rights than you would under a terror dictatorship. And it also creates for at least sort of a nascent, inefficient market and a tax base, right? So this, at first, it tends to lead to sort of a wild explosion of economic growth as these industries are built out, right? You have a monopoly on railroads, and so you're gonna try to build out your railroads as much as you can, so that you can develop a market and start taking in rents. And so all of these sort of these industries, railroads, utilities, manufacturing, mining, oil extraction, etc., sort of boom right off the ground for the first few years. um, but unfortunately, eventually you hit a point where, right, there's no competition. And so not only are your industries inefficient, but they don't have to compete. And so sometimes they'll start overcharging. Um, the people become frustrated because they don't have property rights, and they know, they can't get into the system because all of the industries are monopolized. And so eventually that explosion in growth sort of dies, and you get a very inefficient system, and it becomes a drag on the economy. Okay, so the final part of, the final logic basically is to create an organizational proliferation, right? Create competing organizations and spread out the power, and make the collective action problem far, far more difficult, by spreading out sort of the power in your society. And so this is sort of the Nazi Germany or the Mussolini Italy approach. The idea here, again, is to sort of create competing organizations, and because there's so many organizations, the selectorate becomes very large in these systems, and so that means that property rights tend to be more well respected than in the other two, either the terror or the co-opt systems, right? So while property rights may not be as sort of robust as they are under a democratic system, because the selectorate is basically every citizen or every voting citizen, it's still going to be better than those two former dictatorships that we talked about, at least for organizational members, right? So if you think of Nazi Germany, Nazi Germany had, well spread property rights. They had well protected contract rights, as long as you were sort of a white German Aryan citizen, right? It's not for everybody. It's not for the homosexuals or the blacks or the Jews. Um, and so, in that sense, right, it's still extremely a dictatorship, um, but they do have more widespread property rights. And so, um, um, it is you'll see these governments tend to grow at much higher rates than other dictatorships because of this sort of respect for property rights and the spread of the selectorate. They're still not running at full efficiency, right? Because some members can still be abused and their property can be expropriated. But they should run better. All right, so that's the three logics. At the end of the chapter, he basically says that we should see the organizational proliferation approach, the sort of the one where you spread out the selectorate or and make the collective action problem more difficult for the launching organization. That system should be the most likely to transition toward democracy. Um, because they've already given a widespread swath of the society some sort of property rights and powers. And so it becomes easier to transition toward democracy under those conditions than under conditions of terror or co optation. All right, that's all I've got for you. The next chapter is going to be Electoral Systems and Economic Policy by Torsten Persson and Guido Tabellini. So I will see you for the next one. That one is chapter 40 on page 723. Y'all have a great day, and thanks for sticking with me.